Well, hello everyone. It's John Loughlin here. I'm the director of Forum for Democracy International. Welcome to this week's forum. I'm delighted to be joined by my co-host Peter Lavelle and by our guests Mark Sleboda and George Samueli. We're looking forward also to welcoming Stephen Jermy from Britain, who will join us shortly. I'm speaking to you this week from Trebinje in Herzegovina, Bosnia-Herzegovina. Trebinje, where 150 years ago the Herzegovinan uprising triggered what was known as the Eastern Crisis, which led to the Treaty of Berlin in 1878. A big jockeying for power between, on the one hand, the Western powers, particularly Britain, and on the other side, Russia. And one of the speakers in the conference that I spoke at this morning said the Eastern question is not over. The same jockeying for position that we observed 150 years ago, in this case between Turkey and Britain, has now, as it were, been displaced to another shore of the Black Sea in Ukraine. And the subject that I was hoping to discuss, I'm hoping to discuss this week, is who is winning. When we first programmed this show, we hadn't yet had the drone attacks on the Russian airfields inside Russia, deep inside Russia. Many commentators on the, let's say, non-NATO side have been saying now for 3 years that Russia is winning. But how does the drone attack, how does this, let's admit it, relatively spectacular attack affect that analysis? Mark Sleboda from Moscow.
Okay, so I think the most important thing about this recent attack by the Kiev regime, almost certainly facilitated by Western intelligence assistance, is not so much how the weapons being used, which were relatively bog standard FPV drones, some of them with fiber optic cables. It is the method of delivery.
Yes.
Cargo containers. Now, cargo container warfare has actually long been shall we say, a theoretical subject within security studies. It's been talked about for years. And has been suggested that pretty much every major country now has basically missiles in a box, right, that can be deployed. And the implications of this Pandora's box being finally opened and used on the battlefield. This is a weapon that, whether it's with drones or with missiles, can give any state, no matter how small, or non-state actors, think terrorists, a long-range strike capability, a stealth long-range strike capability. I don't think in the conflict in Ukraine, that attack, except in narrative terms, really affects the combat, right? All of the numbers have been walked back. We're looking at a dozen of strategic bombers, of which Russia still has dozens, and were used only lightly in this conflict, have either been damaged and maybe a few destroyed. But it's the precedent going forward. David Ignatius talked about this in an article in the Washington Post in the last week, arguing that the Kiev regime in Ukraine's dirty war has only just begun. And as the Kiev regime's forces begin to be attrited and crumble more and more on the battlefield, like we're seeing now, increasingly the Kiev regime and its backers are going to turn to asymmetric warfare, unconventional warfare, terrorist bombings, assassinations, very likely false flag uses of chemical weapons, maybe even biological weapons, dirty bombs. This conflict is about to get uglier, even as we approach, I don't like to use the word end game, but we're definitely seeing a new phase of the conflict start.
Yeah, but Mark, so I don't want to push the historical analogies too far, but the point I made in my own talk this morning about the Herzegovinian uprising, it's not a particularly well-known historical event, but I'm sure you'll understand the point I'm making is that asymmetrical warfare can be bloody effective. I'm, after all, in the former Yugoslavia. I've forgotten what the ratio was now of part of German troops required to put down partisans, but it was many, many hundreds. So for each partisan, you needed 100 German troops or whatever. So asymmetrical warfare, under certain circumstances, can work. And is that not, Mark, the Western strategy? General Milley said that before the invasion. He said, we're going to turn Ukraine into an Afghanistan. Is that not the strategy? To harass the Russians for 10, 20 years and get them bogged down, investing more and more regular troops in what might be an unwinnable irregular war, asymmetrical war?
Absolutely. We know that the CIA has openly admitted that they were training Kiev regime's special forces and military intelligence agents in the United States a year before Russia's intervention, at least a year, probably longer. So yes, this is definitely the plan B. This has long been, I would argue, the plan B. And it is something that it is going to bleed Russia, right? There are no good options. There is no clean victory. John Mearsheimer referred to in military, industrial, and attrition terms, Russia's inevitable ugly victory. And I still think that is the best way, because any victory that Russia is going to have, whether it stops, with the 5 former oblasts of Ukraine, or goes to the Dnieper River, or it goes all the way to Kiev and beyond, it's going to be ugly. It's simply the least bad of bad options. There are no good options. So yes, but I expect guerrilla warfare and a very strong asymmetric component of that to be continued. Even if Russia goes all the way to the Polish border, it's not going to stop. There is a hardcore contingent of ideological Banderites. They do not represent the Ukrainian people. They have hijacked an entire nation with Western assistance, but there are enough of them to wage a significant and perpetual guerrilla warfare. At the beginning of this conflict, I was asked in an interview how long this conflict would last. And I was on a panel with several alt-military analysts who suggested it would be over in a couple of months. And I said it would be a forever war. And in one fashion or another.
Yeah, I think I remember you saying that. I think you may have said it as well on our.
Yeah, I mean, going back to Mearsheimer, it's obviously much talked about. I added, ugly victory and miserable peace. And I think that's what we're going to get. To be a little contrarian and not disagreeing with either Mark or John, going back to this spectacular and humiliating, let's admit it, drone attack. You could make the argument, though, this is just a continuation of American policy using surrogates like the MI6, other intelligence. This time it's Ukraine, into inflicting a strategic defeat on Russia. I mean, obviously Ukraine and Ukrainian actors are in play, but this is a continuation. You could go back to the Cold War, you could go back to Napoleon, I suppose, if you want. But, they've always had their eye on a strategic defeat or inflicting a major humiliation on Russia. It doesn't take away from the policy that they are pursuing in Ukraine. But you could make the argument they're separate, but, or just complementary. Mark, what do you think?
Absolutely. And I think we have to keep in mind that Russia was just delivered a strategic defeat, as well as Iran, in Syria. Now, it's not talked about as much, and certainly on Russia's geopolitical prioritization table, Syria is a factorially lower scale than Ukraine. But Russia and Iran and Hezbollah and the Syrian government won the war in Syria, and they lost the peace. That is, I should say, should be a big yellow caution warning for Russia going forward, and not to become complacent simply because of military, industrial, and attrition advantages. Particularly, as John pointed out, what this conflict is likely to, become an asymmetric guerrilla war going forward, that can easily get out of hand as well, particularly if it is continued with, shall we say, a new, not really a cold war, but a tepid hot war with NATO instead of any type of new security architecture, which was perhaps always too optimistic an idea for the end of this conflict.
But the sense of my questions, maybe George, you want to comment on this, and here is Steve Jermy joining us now. Steve, thank you so much. We've in the 10 minutes since we've been on air, we've been talking about the drone attack, the famous drone attack, and so on. And the starting point for this broadcast was the article that you wrote, Stephen, on Russia has the upper hand in the war, and you made a point very well. I've made it in a different way, but you made the point that wars, high intensity land wars, depend on three things. You wrote in your article: men, weapons, and energy. And that was that. I liked that article very much. And I encourage our viewers to read it on Brave New Europe, the website Brave New Europe. But what about the theory of old wars and new wars, Stephen? As you know, there is a lot of talk about new wars, irregular troops, asymmetrical warfare, hybrid warfare, obviously drone attacks, they play into that. Our friend Kit Clarenberg has written recently on how the drone warfare has, as it were, changed the game. How do you see this, Stephen? You I don't know if you're a military historian, but you're a military expert. Is this true about old and new wars? Or is this a fake? In other words, or do we perhaps need both, as it were, old and new wars at the same time? How do you see these, in the context of your analysis about energy, men and weapons, how do you see this latest, admittedly spectacular attack, Stephen?
If I take those two as separate questions, and can I first, I'm sorry I'm slightly late, I'm coming from meetings to meetings, and Peter I've met, George I haven't, but Mark, I'm a great fan of your work, so it's a pleasure to be on here. I think the old wars, new wars is, it's a bit of a chimera, because I remember in the 1990s or so, we went through something called network-centric warfare, and everything was going to be different. And essentially all it did was take the internet and connect all the weapons in a way which is much more integrated. But everybody thought it was terrific and sexy and different, and it wasn't really. I think what the article says, it talks about energy, John, but it also talks about industrial capacity. And if you haven't got the industrial capacity, certainly in anything over than a long war, then it's over. And that was what I was really trying to say. Russia has retained its industrial capacity, and Europe has outsourced its industrial capacity to China, as indeed has America. And we know that's a problem in America, because America is trying to reindustrialize. So, this is what we're seeing playing out. And I talk about it as part of the balance of power. The balance of power has those foundation elements, but then there are also how geopolitically you can use that power. You can be a very strong power like America, which is a very strong maritime and air power, but actually has a relatively small army. And so that's not terribly useful in a land campaign like this. But on the use of the weapons, I haven't heard what others have said. I thought it was a terrible miscalculation. In fact, at levels of risk that are unbelievable from the West, particularly, it sounds like the places that Mark and I come from. I think the idea that we may have that somebody authorized the use of drones against one of Russia's triad, knowing what Russia's doctrine is appallingly risky, even worse than firing missiles into Russia, which was bad enough. So I think it's unconscionable. And unfortunately, we've got a man who is rational in Mr. Putin, and who I suspect looks in a very rational way. I mean, the one thing I'd say is that militarily, it's a pinprick. I mean, of the triad, I'm interested to see what Mark thinks about this, but of the triad, it's the submarine launched and the ground launch missiles, which are probably the more important of the triad, because the air launched, and I'm not as familiar as I should be with air launched missiles from Russia, but air launched are easier to defend against, and so tend to be used more in tactical. So it's the weakest element of the tribe. But it doesn't really matter. The fact that anybody could have thought that it's a good idea to attack that is just unconscionable.
That's is that not a moral position? We were, before you came on air, we were asking whether such asymmetric warfare, however risky, however much we may condemn it, might not, in the very long term, bring about some kind of defeat for Russia, which is the American policy, as General Milley said before the invasion of Ukraine.
I just don't see it. Again, I mean, we know what's happening on the battlefield. I think the last time that were any successes from Ukraine were about 30 months ago. And so, at all, I don't think. I think the moral argument is, we can have a moral argument. We can say who was responsible, who was not. But in a way, that's an esoteric argument, because the critical argument is about the balance of power. And if that overwhelmingly favors Russia, well, so what? I mean, even if we were in the wrong, and actually that Russia was in the wrong, it wouldn't make any difference. And a lot of people in Britain would get very angry about Hong Kong.
That's the point I'm making. That's exactly the point I'm making. Absolutely. So you don't credit then, Stephen, you don't give asymmetrical warfare any. You don't credit it with any genuine capacity except harassment, militarily speaking.
I think asymmetric warfare is essentially means that you're not fighting peer on peer, and what we're really doing here is peer on peer, but using asymmetric means to try and prevent a defeat of the West, which isn't going to happen. So it's rather like, you could say that it's a bit similar to the Germans using V1 and V2 rockets against the British in the Second World War. And it didn't stop the British, and it didn't stop the Americans, who had many forces in Britain at the time. And it'll be the same with this. And the moral argument, I think, is overwhelming in favour of not doing it, because the risk is nuclear confrontation. I think if America had been in this sort of situation, that attack had happened, there'd been DEFCON 4. Wondering whether to press the button or not.
Yeah. No, I was really just trying to get a military analysis of the claim that this kind of attack could turn the tide, and that it could harass the Russians sufficiently, again, according to General Milley, that in the very long term, 10 or 20 years or whatever, they would suffer an Afghanistan such as America suffered it in August 2021.
Well, having served in Afghanistan, that's a very interesting question, because before I went to Afghanistan, I took the opportunity to read the Russian General Staff's analysis of their campaign. And they were much quicker to extract themselves, and did it in a much more efficient way when they realized that actually that there wasn't much to do there, or there wasn't much going to be successful. I think that as regards Afghanistan, it's a good example of how the West isn't able to think strategically in the way that the Russia is. It was a campaign which we should, at the worst, we should have got out of when Osama bin Laden was killed. But to stay on for another 20 years, and people wanted to keep staying on. I once said before, Afghanistan was a campaign where we were taking a perceived security threat and trying to solve it by changing a nation's culture. And surprise, surprise, it didn't work.
That's exactly.
No, indeed. Go ahead, Peter.
The title of our broadcast here, who is winning, and with Ukraine, and I've long taken the position that the focus is should not be on Ukraine per se, because it has an elite that will because there are so many enticements for it to continue, even though military defeat is inevitable. if you can continue to get appropriations from Europe and from the United States, this elite will continue until they're the rainmakers. They make the money, and then when that's all done, they're done here. But I think the question is, and I've gotten a lot of pushback for it, is that when will NATO have enough? Not Ukraine. Mark, you want to field that?
Yeah, I think that there are people, without saying that it is an entirely coherent across the board policy at this point, but I think there are enough people in Europe and the United States that are already planning for the next war against Russia. And entering into an asymmetric phase has long been a plan B that was the training started for it before Russia's intervention in Ukraine began. And essentially, NATO has adopted a policy that there will be no more gray spaces in Europe, no more neutral countries, no more ambiguous states between Russia and NATO. And whatever the end game of this conflict, they intend to continue it past the point of all sanity, and they'll be facilitated by a Banderite motivated Kiev regime elite in Ukraine to continue this conflict in asymmetric terms, in guerrilla terms, eventually forcing Russia to occupy all of Ukraine, because the alternative will be to see any Ukrainian rump state weaponized into a NATO battle platform where the entire population is indoctrinated from childhood in a Banderite anti-Russian ideology. And that occupying West Ukraine is a terrible option for Russia, but it might be a less bad option than the alternative. And all this time, with a campaign of bleeding Russia through a guerrilla war out of Poland and Romania, the goal of NATO, the US and Europe, will be to rebuild their own military capacity and hope to refight this conflict another 5 to 10 years down the road when terms might be better for them.
There's one of Nicholas II's interior ministers, I've momentarily forgotten his name, advised the Russian emperor against taking Galicia. And he said that if Russia were to take Galicia, then it would be a poisoned chalice. And some Russian historians say that that was one of Stalin's greatest mistakes, to do that. Surely, Mark, that would indeed be a terrible poison, a terrible thing for Russia to do if it did go that far.
Absolutely. I agree. I do not disagree at all. I'm simply wondering whether that option, no matter how bad it is, might still be better than the weaponized Galicia as a battle platform against Russia option. There's no good choices, right? There's no happy ending to this. There's only ugly victories and uglier defeats.
We're getting background noise from somebody. Perhaps if everyone could mute when they're not speaking. Stephen, how I know that you've started with Ian Proud, who was going to join us. You're hoping to start a podcast on all this. Do you see, what chances do you see, Stephen, of influencing opinion in Britain, if I may ask? Because Britain's role in this, of course, is really quite crucial.
I think that in Britain and indeed Western Europe and the whole, John, that where people are confused. I think they're starting to get it intuitively, but they're confused because the mainstream media, almost to a man or a woman, are completely self-centered because they believe the Hitlerian the narrative, which is Putin is a Hitlerian bad man and Zelensky is a Churchillian hero. And unfortunately, a lot of the people think that. There are signs, though, of people changing. I think the thing that's going to make the difference is as we start to do what we're seeking to do, which is reindustrialize. And to pick up on Mark's point on the Europeans holding out so they can reindustrialize and be ready to fight the second war. The thing that's going to happen here is that it won't work. And the reason it won't work is due to energy. I work in the energy sector now, in the offshore energy sector. And Europe is deindustrializing in large part because, not just because it shipped everything out to China, but also because it's running out of cheap energy. And you can have as many factories as you like, but if you haven't got access to cheap energy, then we're always going to lose. So the arms race that people might be thinking about is an arms race that I can predict will be lost already. So that's the way I would certainly be thinking of it. Now, what's going to happen in the shorter term, I suspect, John, is that we may see more sanctions, or boomerang sanctions, as I call them. But as those start to have effect, and as we start to reindustrialize, and money is shifted for military purposes, away from societal goods and away from capital investment, and I think it's going to become more and more difficult. At the moment, we've only, I think, made an increase of 0.2% of GDP. Now, we're going to need to, if we want to actually have any chance of catching up, we're going to need to be at about 6% of GDP, which was where Britain was at the end of the Cold War. And the political appetite for that is almost zero, I should have thought. So, you can see that industrially we can't win the race. So I think we'll get to a position soon where such is the political fight back and the political concerns about loss of money from education, from law, from civil society, from the health system, that actually the consensus will start to fall apart. So hopefully we'll be able to actually.
But who's going to pick up the ball? Who's going to pick up the political ball and run with it? Not the Conservative Party.
No, I think that's a question for politicians. I think as well, John, and I'd be curious what everybody else thinks of. I haven't talked to George yet, but I'd also be curious how that plays out in the rest of Europe, because it's pretty much the same issue across Europe. This isn't a British issue. This is a European issue, and to a lesser extent across the states as well. Because even for the states, which is highly indebted, to actually reindustrialize so it can fight. Again, I don't see much appetite for it.
George, do you want to jump in?
Yes, I kind of agree with Mark. I don't think NATO is going to give up anytime soon. We had Mark Rutte speaking at Chatham House yesterday, and essentially it was a call to arms, declaring everybody has to chip in 5% of GDP. Now, of course, that's an unrealistic number, but that's just that we all have to move towards this 5% of GDP. You have to fudge the numbers to get to the 5%. But that's the plan. And if you read the questions that were asked of Rutte, was, well, what are we going to do about Trump? Because Trump wants to abandon Ukraine. How are we going to deal with Trump? Trump is going to, he's going to let us down. He doesn't want to go on fighting for Ukraine. And so Rutte was reassuring, oh, no, don't worry about anything. Trump is on board. So this is the mentality. This is the mentality of this is Chatham House. That's the foreign policy establishment there. This is the foreign policy establishment that you get throughout Europe and the foreign policy establishment in the United States. The only thing that they worry about is that somebody like Trump is going to come along and say, this war is not in our interest and we should just wrap it up. And in fact, maybe Russia should be on our side because the real enemy is China and we want to get Russia on board, which is what Trump really thinks, even though he doesn't really articulated it very clearly, but that is clearly what he thinks. Russia should be our natural ally, but he has no idea how to prevail against this overwhelming consensus among the foreign policy establishment, the military-industrial complex, the media, and so on, who are all on board with continuing with this war. And the truth is that, even if you look at it in terms of, let's say, the war in the four oblasts, and I think with that grind, that attritional grind that, Russia is slowly getting the better of, that's not going to bring the war to an end. Even if once at the end of that process, whereby Russia takes over all four of the oblasts, that doesn't end the war. Because whatever is left of Ukraine, whatever the 80% of Ukraine, that's going to continue the war. And NATO is going to make sure that 80% of Ukraine is going to continue the war against Russia. So it's, just to say that somehow, the battlefield is moving in Russia's direction, that doesn't mean very much if the war is going to continue and Russia will continue to be under threat from the drones, from the missiles, and from everything else that NATO is going to start.
Well, that's what I wanted to discuss with Ian Proud, who unfortunately couldn't join us. He had last-minute engagement, but his recent piece on escalation dominance argues, we were talking about this just a moment ago before going on air, that Russia in this battle, which has been going on, as we know, for more than 10 years, responds with by dominating the escalation, not just by blowing everybody to smithereens, but by upping the ante and by gambling that the West will not be able to respond. And he cites the annexation of Crimea in 2014, and then, of course, the invasion of 2022. I'm sure there are many people in Russia and perhaps outside Russia who are wondering, what is the next stage of escalation dominance after this latest attack? Will there be one? Because the war of attrition, well, it's working, but my God, it's bloody slow.
Yeah, but also, John, and I'll throw it to Mark and to Stephen, of course, George. I mean, so is the West's long-term policy an attritional war against Russia? Because Steve was saying that the West doesn't have the capacity to do that. It would be very different. Unless you want to slash all of education, all of health and human service, all of that stuff, and you have a younger generation that is interested in militarism, which I can't see that in Europe whatsoever. I mean, I see the logic of it, and going back to John Mearsheimer's, an ugly victory, and my addition to it, miserable peace. But does the West have the wherewithal to continue that? I mean, rhetorically, it sounds really nice. We know who Churchill is, we know who Hitler is, but then you get into the nitty gritty. I don't see the West being able to do that. And the reason why I mention it is that I don't think the West can, and that's why I worry about escalation, because that's the only thing left. Anyone can answer that.
Well, I think they can, I think they've got a cheaper model going. They're not going to send any manpower in there, but ultimately, the drones have changed the nature of warfare. They're relatively cheap, and they can be quite destructive. And as long as you can keep producing them, or whatever, the number, thousands a day and whatever, you can go on fighting. You can just keep lobbing drones, and most of them will be shot down, but some of them will do some damage. And so the way they're counting it is that they can continue this war, continue to raise the costs for Russia. That's how they're feeling it. So Russia will continue to suffer from these attacks.
But then again, we go back to escalation. Then the factories that produce this in Poland and Germany will eventually become fair game and targets. Eventually.
Well, that was my question about escalation dominance, because Russia has threatened to potentially attack, split infinitive, has threatened potentially to attack targets in Western Europe. Is that the next step? That's what I'm trying to understand. What might the next step be?
I don't think that, I think I might just, you talked, John, about attrition, and yes, attrition is slow, but of course that's the purpose. But I feel that we're moving to a separate next phase of the war, because it feels to me as if the attrition has been scarily successful. If the figures that people like John Mearsheimer and Doug McGregor are talking about of 1.4 million Ukrainians killed in action and 50,000 killed in Kursk. And of course, you're now getting to the stage where actually, even with drones, and I will understand that, but even with drones, it's a real struggle to actually hold a defensive line. I think we're starting to see movement, which is deliberate movement on the defensive line, and I think that such as the range of the defensive line, and such as the scale, the 3-to-1 advantage that the Russians have. But I think we may be not that far away from the beginning of the collapse of the Ukrainian army. I wondered last year whether this might be happening, but the signs are better. And I'm also starting to think about it in a slightly different way, because I'm not so sure it's about escalation dominance, it's about strategy. I've always felt the Russian had a very clear strategy. I read a book on strategy. This isn't a plug for it because it's out of print. But I did like to say that it's the best book written on strategy by a British senior officer for the last 70 years, because it's the only one. But actually, what I was actually writing about was saying that we've got to work out how to think strategically better. And the West now have Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, and Ukraine, or thinking. But my thing now is that actually the sort of my guess is that Putin's objective now is to accept that he's going to find it very difficult to negotiate with anybody. That the Americans, though, are a bit wishy-washy and probably want to get out of it. Even so, it's difficult to negotiate with the Americans, but he'll want to maintain a good relationship with them because they're great powers. And then I think he cares less about the Europeans, because I suspect that he thinks, and I think, that the Europeans are going to do themselves in economically. And so the capacity to actually do much after a bit will fall away. So I suspect, and this is a guess, that he'd probably want to go not even as far as the Dnieper. I always thought that that would be the case. But my guess is that he'll think about Novorossiya and actually going around Novorossiya. I thought it was very interesting that he's talking in the north, in the Sumy region, about zones, buffer zones, but in this elsewhere he's talking about taking these oblasts back into Russia. So I noticed as well that in the piece that Lavrov and the team put up on what Russia's terms were, they didn't talk about protecting the Russian people. They talked about protecting the Russian and the Russian-speaking people, and that's interesting because it means the Ukrainians who speak Russia. And so when you look at Novorossiya, what you've got there essentially is not only a large either Russian or ethnically Russian people or Russian-speaking people. You've also got a broad set of people who voted in the past for closer relationships with Russia. So I can imagine them thinking, okay, well let's get to Odessa, let's get past Odessa, close up with the Transnistria border, clear off that issue, and I've closed down the threat that I might get from the maritime in the Black Sea, secured my southern border, and then I can just wait for Ukraine to fall apart. Despite the best efforts of the European, and hopefully at some stage, I might be right and I might be wrong on this, but hopefully at some stage there'll be an internal falling apart of Ukraine, with one or two people who might be more sensible, the sort of person like Klitschko, who seems to have a bit more of a practical approach to the war rather than the Spanderites who are determined to head on to their Götterdämmerung and final utter defeat.
But sorry, Stephen, you think then that Russia might try to conquer Odessa, because that surely is a very, very major move. That's really what I was hinting at in my questions about escalation, because crossing the river, taking Nikolaev, taking Odessa, that's urban warfare. That is surely very, very costly for Russia.
Yeah, true, but not necessarily, in as much it depends how you do it. If you go north of Odessa to the Transnistria border, then essentially, and then let's cut it off, because I think the Dnipropetrovsk itself is also another issue like this, and it is urban warfare, which the Russians will not want to engage in. They may not actively, but as soon as you've cut off the city, then essentially you're starting it'll start to fall apart, I suspect. You don't need necessarily to go into urban warfare, although they've done it in Mariupol. So I don't see that as escalation. I see that as the continuation of a strategy to get to a situation where I can feel myself secure. And with Novorossiya, the south and the center, and buffer zones in the north, then I would feel reasonably secure. And then if I've got the security there, then I can sort of wait out the rest and see how the rest of it develops. And I think that the chances of that are high, because I think that actually had the Ukrainians agreed to the terms, then we might be in a different situation. But I think now that if I was in Putin's position, this is what I would do. There's a question, though, about whether they've got sufficient land forces to do it. You may need to mobilize even more to do that, but certainly it's the way I'd be thinking.
Mark.
Can I just ask you, sorry, I just want to ask, how might this happen, Stephen? Where do they cross? At Kherson, or do they cross above Kharkov? How does it, because that's an awfully long way from Odessa.
Yeah, I've been watching this actually. I've been watching it like a hawk, because I predicted this about sort of a year and a half ago. And I could be wrong, because you could say, well, that's a very natural defensive border. But the problem with the defensive border, it's also a sort of line in the sand, and people can chuck things at you from the other side. So that's why I've been beginning to think that they might move further. And the two things that have made me think that the two things that made me think about it is that The Russians have said this and have said that actually, if we don't agree to the 4-hour blast, then they won't take war. But also, there was a press conference about 2 years ago when Putin was asked by a Russian journalist the Russian journalist said, if I'm going to be going to Odessa in the future, should I be going with a Russian passport or a Ukrainian passport? And Putin was amusingly guarded on the answer, which makes me think that it's always been part of an option, should I say. And in terms of maximum security for Russia, then securing that southern border would be the way that I'd be thinking about it.
Mark Sleboda.
Yeah, so one of the first things I think we need to keep in mind when we're talking about winning and losing this war, what victory means for both sides, is that it's not a binary. In fact, it's a continually changing definition of what it means. And when we talk about the West as continuing a war, a proxy war against Russia, against all sense, that is draining themselves, they're, I think, keeping in mind what exactly the definition of a Russian victory is, and trying to limit it in geopolitical terms. When it comes to escalation dominance, certainly the escalation to attack, part, however effectively or ineffectively, part of Russia's nuclear triad. I mean, that's a deliberate provocation more than it is any battlefield utility in this conflict. From the very beginning, whoever, in the United States and then other European governments, they have counted that Putin is more rational, pragmatic, restrained, and cautious than they are. They view that as a weakness, and that is why they continually try to provoke Russia in ways that routinely risk throwing us back into Cuban Missile Crisis moments, because they are confident that Putin will not respond to it. I mean, however much they may caricature and picture him as a demon and Hitler and the Dark Emperor, whatever, they are actually counting on his restraint and rationality, and that frees them to act unrestrained and unrational. I absolutely agree with Steve on the long-term prospects of a decades-long attritional war against Russia, bringing in questions of domestic political support in Europe, bringing in questions of energy. But because we recognize those strategic limitations and weaknesses, that doesn't mean that the people in Western capitals who are making those decisions will either recognize or accept those limitations. Continually, they seem to talk themselves out of any such situations. We cannot count on their logic making sense in strategic terms, because it hasn't from the beginning. Unfortunately, Odessa, my wife, mea culpa, full disclosure, is Crimean, and we have family in Crimea and Donbass and Kharkov and Odessa, distant family. But I think I have a handle on the sentiment on the ground. And Odessa is a Russian city. I mean, through and through. There's no question about that. The problem with Odessa is its geography. A contested Dnieper crossing, an amphibious assault is just not realistic, to take Odessa. Even in World War II, the Red Army had to go north and go south to take Odessa, which means ultimately, I think we're going to see some type of move on Kiev before we ever see a Russian move on Odessa. And there's probably the hope, whether it's true or not in the Kremlin, that Odessa falling into Russia's hand will be more of a diplomatic, unconditional surrender, if that ever comes to pass. And by moving on Kiev, I don't necessarily mean taking Kiev, simply putting a type of siege and limiting the logistics in central Ukraine like that. I hear the Kiev regime right now is talking that Russia has plans to take all of the 4 oblasts, or most of it, certainly the Donbass, by the end of this year. And then by next year, move to cut off the Dnieper, maybe not with regards to the south, but everything to the east. And I think those are actually now realistic terms. And part of that is the manpower problems. I have no doubt that the Kiev regime is going to mobilize 18 to 25-year-olds. That'll give them another 300,000 or so troops for a time. And they're going to effectively conscript women as well. They continually talk about that. But ultimately, the terrain difference and the lack of fortifications, once you start moving into Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporozhye region, etc., is going to mean that Russia is going to move much faster next year.
Next year.
Yes, exactly. It's going on. The light at the end of the tunnel keeps receding. What do we think about other forms of asymmetrical warfare? When they launched the drone attacks on the on the military bases inside Russia, the Ukrainians were very proud of it. They told us all about it. It'd been 18 months in preparation, this, that, and the other. The truck drivers didn't know but what was in their lorries and so on. They gave us so much detail about it that we assume that they won't try that one again because that's a one-off. What other asymmetrical, spectacular attacks might they pull off?
Well, they could pull off assassinations, all manner of terrorist incidents inside Russia. They could also attack shipping that's involved in transporting Russian oil to various parts of the world. So that was outlined in that David Ignatius article, that there were all these different kind of global possibilities for Ukraine, and of course Ukraine's enablers. If Ukraine doesn't have anything like a kind of a global intelligence reach, but nonetheless they can do all kinds of things in order to hurt Russia, and so that would still all be part of the NATO strategy of inflicting pain and to go on inflicting pain on Russia. So I think that there will be a lot more of these assassinations, and ultimately they're always presenting Russia with this kind of a fait accompli. Well, what are you going to do about it? I mean, you keep complaining that the Western intelligence services are behind it, but you're not actually doing anything about it. You're basically sitting on your hands. You keep complaining about the British. Lavrov said the other day, oh, it was the British who were behind this. Okay, well, the British are there, they're having their nice, dinners in London, but you're not doing anything about them. So that's kind of the problem, that the asymmetric warfare, that it puts the pressure on Russia, and in a way, Russia is made to look weak.
Yeah, that's but right. George, we all know that there's a discussion going on immediately after that spectacular drone attack that adding a layer or shifting toward moving away from the SMO to an anti-terror campaign, which would, everything you just mentioned would be part of everything you mentioned that the West and Ukraine can do, Russia could do itself, okay? Because we haven't seen political assassinations. I was here during the second Chechen conflict, okay? That's ugly, okay? That's anti-terrorism. That is going after politicians. It's going after civil society. It's it's something that nobody here wants to go down, but knows very well.
But is that likely to happen? Do you think Russia
Well, that's
is
what I'm asking you guys.
Right.
I try to have better questions than answers, okay?
Right. Well, so far, Russia has behaved in a very, very cautious, very prudent way. It knows that the West is trying to provoke it. The West is constantly trying to poke the bear, so to speak, to try to provoke it into doing something that would then be seen to be dangerously escalatory. I mean, and Russia doesn't want to do that. So far, it has limited its war to the territory of Ukraine. It's threatened to go beyond it, but it's never done that. So everything that Russia has done, including the use of the Oreshnik, has been on the territory of Ukraine. So this would be a major shift on Russian policy if it decided.
We were talking about escalation, and the whole focus here is on escalation. So I throw it to everybody else.
Yes.
Escalation, the next level of escalation is essentially, from the NATO's perspective, is a challenge to Article 5. Mark, what do you think about that?
Well, sorry, could I just, before you answer, Mark, say we had about a year ago, I can't remember exactly when, we had an Iranian commentator on after one of the exchanges of fire between Israel and Iran, Ehsan Safinejad, and he was explaining to us that Iran was very measured in its response, but when the response came, it would be devastating and so on. And the Iranians also sat on their hands, essentially, as far as I can tell. And then you had the decapitation of Hezbollah with the beepers. And other attacks. So sitting on your hands may seem very clever, or certainly is presented as very clever by some parties, but is it a winning strategy?
I think that as increasingly as the Kiev regime and its NATO backers are forced to move more to asymmetric, unconventional warfare in the next year plus as this conflict, reaches an inevitable attritional conclusion, that it is going to be forced, Russia is going to be forced to transform the conflict in legal terms, internal legal terms, to a counter-terror operation. That has all kinds of implications, though, because while it will open up the Russian military to targeting intelligence, political, military leaders, there's also, it's going to raise a lot of questions then. How are the Geneva Conventions applied to Ukrainian troops then? If they're part of a terrorist organization, are they no longer afforded the same Geneva Convention rights that Russia has largely followed up till now? So there's a whole lot of can of worms that are going to be opened up by that. When you ask about what kind of escalations, drones, increasingly, I mean, drones have changed this war. Russia is now producing more than 300,000 FPV drones a month, 500 Garans. The Kiev regime has shifted kind of amazingly to an all-drone strategy out of a lack of artillery and other equipment, and for all its limitations, done very well with it. But I mean, drones are going to become ubiquitous, but we also need to think in terms of cheapness and asymmetric. We're going to see bombings on the Moscow metro, probably Banderite suicide bombings, something that I talked about. They're going to make this bloody. And if the Western press can justify flying drones intentionally into skyscrapers in Moscow City as bringing the war home to the Russian people, then they'll be able to wave away attacks on Russian civilians as well. That's why I say this is going to get increasingly bloody and nasty on both sides. And again, Russia they see that their attritional strategy, the industrial war is working, and they're so loath to go outside that box and launch strikes into Germany or Poland or Romania. That continues to be the logic, to not get outside of the box that we're winning in. But things are going to get nasty. Public pressure is going to increase. And at the end of the day, we don't know what decisions are going to be made in the Kremlin.
Yeah, I think that makes really good sense. I thought when we were launching ATACMS and Storm Shadow into Russia, I thought that was a terribly strategically risky thing to do with no military purpose. And same with these drones. I think one of the things that will be interesting here is to see how things develop in America. What the mistake Ukraine has made, and indeed Israel has made exactly the same mistake, and so is NATO making, is they're assuming that America is omnipotent. that actually, if the decision is made for America to enter the combat, then that'll be fine. I didn't ask for it was in responsible statecraft. It must have been about January. And in it, I explained that actually NATO, even with America on board, could not win a war against Russia.
Yeah, we had you on. We talked about that.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful article.
And as soon as you see that, you start to think differently, and people are starting to see it. So I think the interesting thing is that I don't really think that, apart from the neocons and the deep state, and that is a very tricky thing to sort, the vast majority of the American people don't want this war. They'd rather be out of it. They're more interested in China, although I don't think they're that interested. And they ought to be concerned about the Gulf, because we all export or we all import oil from the Gulf. So that's the place that I'd be much more interested in. So I think they want out. And I think that the issue here is if America gets out, it's how it gets. I think America's got three options. The first is step in and reinforce. And I would like to think there's now enough political atmospherics against that to do it. The second is to peter out, which is pretty much doing what they're doing slowly. But the decisive thing would be to step out. And if I were advising Trump, I'd say don't just step out, but step out of NATO at the same time. Because stepping out of NATO at the same time would make a dramatic difference. I think Putin would actually think, okay, that's the major threat that's out of this. And frankly, I think I said in that article, John, no, NATO exists to confront a threat created by its own existence.
Absolutely.
But doesn't have the military capacity to confront the threat that its existence has created.
I know we're rapidly running out of time, but can NATO, the deep state, permanent bureaucracy, whatever term you want to apply, considering Mark has given us the operative word, years, can they outlast Trump?
I think they're going to be very badly damaged as this falls apart. The two entities that are going to fall have been very badly damaged: the European Union, which is already under pressure now, and NATO. And I think NATO could possibly outlast Trump, but I don't think the Americans are beginning to wonder why should they keep paying. So, to me, it's a waste of money, and we'd be much better putting all our thought and thinking into the OSCE, of which Russia's a member. And then we could start talking cooperatively as opposed to trying to confront NATO.
Stephen, last question very quickly. You say the British people, the American people don't want this. That may be true. But what about the military top brass? Surely decisions are not taken by the people, certainly not in European countries. Do you have any sense of the realism of which you are yourself a proponent, dawning on the military top brass, say, for instance, in the United States?
See it in probably about 20% of the retired military. About 80% of them are still they're still in the political narrative. I once said about 9 months ago that West's being guided by a political narrative and the Russia's being guided by a military strategy, and I think that's still the case. I'd be interested to see there, because there are changes at the top in the British military. I suspect there are other people within the American military and the European militaries who are also perhaps more thoughtful about this. We do see signs of it at about colonel level through all of our contacts. But what we really need is a visionary military leader who said, look, we cannot win this. I also don't know what's happening right up at the top of the European establishments and whether the politicians are being advised that they can't win it, but they're still trying to talk their way out of it. I would like to think that there's enough military sense up there to have done the military calculation to show that we can't, but I'm not so sure.
Yeah, well, I'm afraid I think that is the key question. I think that we have to somehow try to work out what people are thinking, what they're being advised, and how they assess the situation. Stephen, Jermy, thank you so much for joining us. George, Mark, Peter, wonderful as ever. See you again next week. Bye.